Hi, everyone. You've reached S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, and I'm super delighted to announce that I'm here with Ken Samples, Dr. Ken Samples, who's out of Reasons to Believe, which is a tremendous organization. And I'm also here with Lisa Quintana, who is a Biola graduate. So we've got a couple of very interesting people today, and we're going to discuss this book, which is Classic Christian Thinkers, and it was written by Ken, and this is a much needed textbook. And so let me go ahead and have each of you introduce yourselves, and then we'll talk about what we're going to talk about.
Well, very good. I'm Ken Samples, and I'm part of the senior scholar team here at Reasons to Believe. Reasons is a science, faith, think tank, apologetic organization, and I'm kind of the oddball. I'm the non-scientist. I work in the area of philosophy and theology primarily, and I'm an adjunct teacher at Biola.
And that's wonderful. And Lisa was one of your students, I understand.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, so I'm Lisa Quintana, and I am a Christian apologist, and I blog at Think Divinely, and I took Ken's critical thinking and logic class, which I'm still trying to learn how to do the logic part of it, because I tend to be one of those people that Ken has written this book for. I previously was much more oriented toward my feelings and sort of emotional-based Christianity, and God challenged me that I cannot be that anymore, and that I need to love the Lord thy God with all my mind. And so that's why I became a Christian apologist.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So and it is a needed book, because a lot of times people don't realize, some people think that, at least I've heard some arguments that people think that maybe there weren't some great Christian thinkers, and that Christianity is the default for people who have no reason to have anything but faith. There's no reasoning behind the faith. And so I think that this is a very important book. And so should we talk about, maybe we should talk about the motivation for writing this book, and also about, we'll highlight maybe some of the great thinkers who are in this book. So.
Yeah, I think what strongly motivated me to write the book is there are a lot of evangelicals who maybe their orientation is not kind of historical and classical. I want to really kind of introduce a lot of my evangelical friends to thinkers that they might think are Roman Catholic, or they may think they're Eastern Orthodox, but in many ways they're just for all Christians. And so this was my attempt to try to challenge people to think more broadly about the nature of Christianity and introduce them to some of the very best thinkers the church has ever had.
Yeah, and I noticed in there you do bring a variety of different sects of Christianity. So you did mention some Roman Catholics. You've got Martin Luther in there as well. You also have Calvin. So what was is that your motivation, just to sort of unite Christians, put us all together on a united front?
Yeah, there is an element of that. I certainly appreciate all of these 9 that I chose, and they've all had very broad influence. But I did want to choose people from the breadth of Christendom, and there certainly is a respectful ecumenism. I realize that there are differences that Christians have, but I think often there are times in which Christians need to stand together. So the book definitely tries to promote unity as well as truth among all believers.
Yeah, that's really good. And so let's talk about let's start talking about these people. So which one do you think? Now, I know you and I both, I read in your book that you definitely have an affinity to C.S. Lewis, and he happens to be my very favorite in your book. But of course, you've mentioned some other great ones. But maybe we should start talking about C.S. Lewis, because I'll be honest, that actually, his book, Mere Christianity, is one of the ways that I came back to Christianity from floundering around for about 20 years. So.
Well, that's interesting, because the very first Christian book I ever read was Mere Christianity. I kind of grew up in a nominal Catholic family. I read Lewis's book when I was a young man in college, and it had a deep influence on me. I didn't know that Christians could think that carefully and communicate so clearly. You know, it's interesting. There's really kind of 3 C.S. Lewises. There's C.S. Lewis, the great children's author, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia that sold 100 million copies, by the way. Then there is C.S. Lewis, the lay theologian and Christian apologist, the author of Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, etc. And then there is the Lewis that was a great literary critic who was a scholar of Renaissance and medieval literature. So I wanted to include Lewis because I love what he says. He says, for every modern book you might read, you should read 2 old books. And one of the things I want people to do if they read through my book is maybe to read a Lewis book or an Augustine book or Athanasius. Actually read these great Christian thinkers because, as you noted earlier, there are many non-believers who think that Christians are feelers, they're not thinkers. And certainly there are times, there's a place for feelers. I like warm people. I like caring and loving people. But I also want people to realize how robust Christian history has been. And so C.S. Lewis, even though he lived in the 20th century, he would be one of those 9 that I think are just one of the most influential thinkers in our faith.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Lisa.
C.S. Lewis is one of my favorites too. I love the fact that he can be an intellectual academic and then he can go into this whole fictional Narnia world. I mean, that's hard to do, to be able to do both of those things. I think that's very challenging. But I really liked what you said, Ken, about the fact that, you know, Christians in general have been sort of stereotyped as, you know, kind of feeler-oriented people. I mean, I will confess, I was one of those people. I got saved into a very charismatic church, the Vineyard Christian Fellowship, and I was not raised a Christian, and I was not encouraged to, you know, study the greats like you're talking about. And then when I got saved into this Christian fellowship, it was very loving and very caring, and people were awesome. But no one ever told me about these classics that you've written about. I didn't even hear about them really until I started going to Biola and started, you know, I heard about C.S. Lewis and I had read some of his stuff before, but, you know, Thomas Aquinas, and I know people say Augustine, but I like Augustine. I think it sounds better. But, you know, I mean, I just think that there's have been this anti-intellectual attitude that I don't know how that creeped into the church. I think it's possibly some misinterpretations of scripture where, you know, Paul was talking about, you know, don't get caught up in human philosophies and this and that. But I think people have interpreted that. And so they said, oh, well, then we shouldn't get involved in any of that, you know, and they threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, what's interesting is, and this was one of my goals, to try to encourage people to read the writings of these thinkers, because, you know, if you go to a great books program, let's say you go to Thomas Aquinas College or Biola, or you just pick up the Adler's book, The Great Thinkers of Western Civilization, you're going to have these Christian books right there. Augustine's Confessions is going to be in there. Aquinas's Summa Theologica. You're going to have books by these Christians. So I think it's important for Christians to appreciate that these Christian thinkers are not writing just Christian classics. They're writing literary classics that have stood the test of Western civilization. So we can learn a lot from them. I see them as my friends. I see them as mentors. They encourage me, and I see their flaws, but I realize that God can use imperfect people, and I'm a very imperfect person.
Yeah, and I like in your book, what you did that I think is really great is at the end of each chapter, you mentioned the writings and your recommendations for what we should read about from these writers. And I think that's great because that leads people to look on the internet. I mean, we can find any of these books on the internet.
Yes.
In fact, I bet you we could probably download PDF files of these books pretty easily on the internet. So, and I've actually downloaded a few books that way. And so, because they're so old, because they've been around for so many years. Right. So that's something that's pretty neat.
But you know what, SJ, I still love good old fashioned paper books, the whole PDF and Kindle books. I don't know, there's something about turning the pages, and I love to highlight stuff. And I mean, I'm kind of, you know, I get into my books and I draw on them. So, you know, I mean, I think it's great that they have free PDF downloads, but nothing's like a good solid book that you can put in your hands.
I totally agree with you, and that's why I'm glad I have this book, and I've got a bookshelf just full of books, and I actually do that on purpose because I always think, I lost all of my data on my computer in January, almost everything that I had from years. I mean, over a decade worth of data on my computer. It just crashed, and I had some backup stuff, but I was able to reload some things. But having those physical books, when I have these two little kids, I know that it's nice to have them in the house. And one day when they become very curious, they'll have access to all of these great books that they'll see in the house.
That's right.
And C.S. Lewis, by the way, said that he was born in a library. That's another feature of my book. I'm really trying to encourage people to be readers, to be thinkers, to feel comfortable, and to communicate to our non-Christian friends that Christians are feelers. We have warm hearts, but we have sturdy heads as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And I'll tell you how I came to find C.S. Lewis is I was searching for answers to questions about life, basically, and I was saying lots of prayers and trying to get God's attention. and one day I got onto a plane, and I saw this man who was sort of surreal, standing out in the airline, waiting in the airline line, and then he sat next to me. His wife sat next to him in the plane, and he asked me. He said, "What do you?" And I don't know what spurred him to talk to me, because a lot of times I don't even talk on the plane. But he said, "What?" I ignore my neighbors sometimes. It'd be like that, but he said something like, "Well, what do you want to do with your life?" And I said, one of my goals has always been to write a book, a children's book similar to C.S. Lewis's Narnia books, and because I had loved those books. Yeah. And he said, "Have you read his adult books?" And I said, "No." And so I went out, after I got off the plane, I immediately ran out and got Mere Christianity, Great Divorce, what's the other one? Screw Tape Letters. I got this big book that has all of these, that book and some other books in them, or those books. And as soon as I read the quote, the trilemma, that actually was a game changer. I remember reading that quote, running around my parents' house, reading it to my parents, reading it to my brother. I just wanted everybody to hear that, because I felt like that was it for me. It basically, you have a choice. He didn't give us the choice to call him a mere prophet. He's much more than that. He called himself the Son of Man.
Yes. I mean, I've known a lot of people who've only read Lewis's literature and not read his apologetics or maybe even his literary writings. But that, what he calls the shocking alternative there in Mere Christianity, that there's only certain alternatives you have concerning Jesus. And I love the way Lewis is so careful and so crisp in the way that he presents that argument. That argument had a powerful impact on me when I was a young college student as well.
I really liked The Abolition of Man.
Oh, yeah.
Because I thought that was so prophetic. I mean, we're living that now today, and to see, he saw he saw it coming. I mean, he could tell, this whole relativism thing. And I mean, he was just going to go into really bad places and, subjectivism and all that. And I thought, oh my gosh, if he was alive today, I wonder what he'd be writing today,
Yeah, and of course, what's interesting is that Lewis died the very same day that President Kennedy was killed. Aldous Huxley, another philosopher and author, died the same day. And what's interesting is that Lewis's following was larger in America than it was in Great Britain. But Christians here didn't know about his death for a couple weeks because of all the coverage of the Kennedy assassination. So Lewis, by the way, also said he thought 5 years after his death he'd be forgotten, but he was wrong about that. His books sell better today than they ever have when he was living.
Wow. It's so funny because the pastor on the plane that I bumped into, he told me that exact same fact. And he said, 1,000 years from now, I'll bet you that the only one of those three who will be remembered is C.S. Lewis. And I thought, what an interesting prediction that we won't know because we won't be here.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And you think of these other Christian thinkers who people have been reading their books. I mean, Augustine for 1,600 years. People have been reading Thomas for 800 years. So it's remarkable how enduring these Christian authors have been.
Yeah, and it's interesting if we go back to Thomas Aquinas and we look at his prime mover idea, and he came up with some very interesting things that it took until last century before we appreciated the idea of the Big Bang, and so he spoke of that back then.
That's right. Thomas is, of course, in the 13th century. He is the world famous Catholic thinker. And he had what he called the 5 ways. These are 5 arguments for God. He begins with his argument from motion. And what's interesting is that Thomas, of course, was an expert on Aristotle, kind of had a Christian Aristotelian synthesis. But it's interesting that Thomas presented an argument for God's existence. And you're exactly right. Today, when we look at Big Bang cosmology, when we look at modern cosmology, scientific cosmology of today fits really well with many of these arguments that Christians were setting forth in the Middle Ages. And so that's a remarkable thing.
Oh, that really is. And, you know, I have spoken with Hugh Ross. He was on my channel not too long ago. Yeah. What's that?
That's my boss, Hugh Ross.
Yeah. Well, I've read 5 of his books, and so
wow.
I can't get it up. Actually, I saw him speak. He came to my school and he spoke last year, and so I was super excited about that. I felt like it was a celebrity coming from around the world, you know, across the country to come speak at my school. I'm in Florida, and so I bought 3 of his books right there, and then maybe it was 4. I think I might have bought 4 that day, and I had Improbable Planet. But I mentioned that because he said, and I like what he said. He said that, you know, he wasn't raised to be a Christian, and he was searching in his teens, and the only book that actually well accommodated his scientific beliefs was the Bible.
Yeah. Well, it's a remarkable testimony because, you know, here is a guy who had very little contact with Christians, and yet he really was he pursued Scripture. Started with a Gideon Bible, and you know, that's why I think Reasons to Believe ministry is so important. It's one of the reasons I really wanted to work here. It's so important that people recognize that science and faith are not enemies, they're allies. That the earliest Christians, the early part of science was dominated by Christians, and science has a deep philosophical and historical connection. And so Hugh's books remain very popular, and he helps people who maybe have a Christian roots but aren't quite sure how a math, science, STEM background fits. And so Hugh is very inspirational in his messages, and so he kind of gives the new reasons, and I give the old reasons, and hopefully they're all very robust.
Along the lines of those old reasons, Ken, I was curious, you chose 9 in your book. Why those 9?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lisa. I think probably for a couple reasons. One of them is I have an appreciation and a connection to the 9, but I also wanted to pick 9 that would kind of go across Christendom. And so some of the early ones are a little more connected with Eastern thinking, Eastern Orthodoxy. Some of them are Catholic, some are Protestant. And then you have people like Lewis, who has kind of a universal appeal. I think I also, I picked those 9 because they're all very strong in theology, philosophy, and apologetics. So there are many others I could have picked, but I'm a baseball fan, so the number 9 seemed to fit there pretty well.
That's a good way to put it. So number 9.
Kind of the manager.
Another hidden meaning.
Yeah, there you go.
No, that's good. That's good. Now, going back to, I just want to go back to the science idea really quickly, because one of the questions that I had from Susan, who's in the chat right now, this is actually being aired live on YouTube in case you didn't know. So one of the questions I had from Susan was, she said, she was talking about C.S. Lewis's position on evolution and how, wondering whether, what you thought of that, what you thought of his position on evolution, if you've looked into that.
Yeah, you know, I think it's important to appreciate that Lewis is born into the world. He's born in 1898. He dies in 1963. But Lewis was influenced by a lot of secularism. The last 50 years of the 19th century, you have people like Friedrich Nietzsche, God is Dead. You have Darwin and the evolutionary theory. You have Marx and various other people. So Lewis is born when there is a zeitgeist of secularism that is extremely strong. Lewis did hold to some type of evolution. Now, whether it's theistic evolution or whether it might be similar to what we at RTB would hold, kind of an old earth creationist view, certainly Lewis thought that God could possibly have used evolution. I don't hold that view. RTB doesn't hold that view. But of course, what's interesting here is you can learn from all of these 9 thinkers and not necessarily agree with everything that they say. And that's, of course, what a mature Christian should do. We should be able to learn and grow, whether we agree or disagree. But yes, Lewis believed that God may have used evolution in his creation of the world and of humanity.
Yeah, and I think that's a reasonable belief. And I've read Hugh's book, and you know, he goes back to the literal Adam and Eve, and I'm actually completely fine with that as well. You know, I think that there were 2 first people. So I know that a lot of people have this idea that you know, there was some sort of a bottleneck of humans, and that 2000 basically popped into existence all at once. But that doesn't make any sense. There had to be 2 first ones.
Right.
So.
Right. Very good.
And yeah, so so that's just something. I mean, and I don't think that science, and you know, the interesting thing is a lot of the great scientists of the past were Christians. And so, in fact, going back to C.S. Lewis, Francis Collins, his story of how he came to Christianity was he basically started reflecting on the trilemma, and it really made an impact on him.
Yeah, he was reading Mere Christianity. Chuck Colson also said something very similar, that Mere Christianity had a big influence on him as well. Yeah.
So in your book, with the other great thinkers that you highlight, do you think Thomas Aquinas would be most scientific minded?
Well, that's a great question. I think that probably the most scientifically oriented person I write about in my book is Blaise Pascal. Oh. Pascal was one of the founding fathers of science. He was a physicist. He was a mathematician. He was a logician. He invented a calculating machine in the 1600s that many people in technology say was the first step toward a computer. And so I think Pascal has a very powerful scientific resume. But nonetheless, I think some of the arguments that are presented by some of the other thinkers, and particularly Thomas Aquinas, would have that idea of arguing both in cosmology, arguing kind of a design, a fine-tuning, as we might refer to it today. But Pascal was an extraordinary scientist, and nonetheless had a deep conversion to Christianity, and developed a very powerful Christian apologetic.
So Ken, you said a lot of the stuff you learned about or read about, and even when you were back as a teenager. So have you always been a Christian?
Well, my parents converted to Catholicism when I was a 4-year-old boy. So I was baptized at, by the way, the parish I was baptized was St. Athanasius Parish. And on the door of the church, I couldn't pronounce his name when I was a young boy, but on the front of the church, it said Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. So I was exposed to kind of Catholic thinkers. I was exposed to kind of a Catholic worldview. I didn't take it terribly serious until really I got into college, and there were things in my life that made me give greater consideration to what I would call the big issues of life. But it was reading Lewis and then reading others that really drove me to make a life commitment to my faith. And I was always kind of a thinker. And, you know, when I left the Catholic Church, I was attending a church that, well, it wasn't terribly intellectual. So at school, I would study philosophy, and at church, we wouldn't ever talk about reason. And I had a bit of a crisis because I thought, well, I don't seem to fit. At school, we talk about reason, but no faith. At church, we talk about faith, but no reason. And fortunately, I bumped into professors who introduced me to St. Augustine, introduced me to Thomas Aquinas, encouraged me to read and to go back and read more C.S. Lewis. So, you know, loving God with your mind is part of us loving him with our entire being. And so my Christianity has been especially strong since my college years.
That's amazing, because I grew up as a Catholic myself, and I left the faith along with my parents and my two brothers. The only one who was left behind in the faith is my sister, who stayed a Catholic. But I left the faith, and I was in a crisis for 20 years. I didn't know, I wasn't sure that Jesus resurrected. I was reading books that led me to think that Buddhism was superior, and so God sort of reached out and suddenly made a huge impact on me about 7 years ago, and ever since then, I feel like I'm behind. So I'm trying to catch up.
Well, I watch you guys on Twitter. I think you're doing pretty well. You certainly get a lot of people's attention, and
today I did. I have no idea what's going on. I had 107,000 views in the last 24 hours.
I've gotten a lot of people following me because you've mentioned my name. So you're doing very well. Keep up the good work.
Oh, well, thank you. No, actually what happened was there's a woman out of Australia who has 96,000 followers, and she started tweeting at me. So all of her followers are paying attention. It's kind of funny. So,
well, you can reach people on social media. It is possible.
I know. It's one of those things, though, because I always have to remember, I'm trying not to, you do want to shake things up a little bit, but you don't want to hurt people. And so, and I'm trying to be as kind as I can. And I get to the point where unfortunately I've had to block a lot of people, and I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to distance them, but I also don't, I'm afraid if I see them on my timeline that others might, start questioning their own faith, or maybe these people will insert ideas that others can't really handle. And so so that was, and I've been told that by some people, some Christians who used to follow me don't follow me anymore because they said they get bothered when they see the notifications in my timeline. So
well, social media it's a unique opportunity to reach people from many different walks of life. On the other hand, it's sometimes challenging, as you say, to be winsome and to have meaningful conversations in, only a few exchanges and a limited number of characters. But, I think it's great that I know both of you are on there and you're responding to people. And, I try to do the same thing. I try to invite them to consider reading some really good Christian sources.
Well, that's the key, Ken, I think, is that too many people want, 280 characters and get their Christianity in these short little snippets, or to develop a deeper appreciation of the Christian faith. You can't do that. You have to crack a book. You have to open this stuff up. You have to unplug yourself, find yourself a good corner with a nice warm blanket and a good book and a cup of coffee, and you're ready to go for for a while. Okay. And I know the younger generation, the reason why I like to use social media is because I think the younger generation primarily is on social media. And so if I can at least spark an interest in a younger person's mind to crack open your book or whatever book, your book sounds to me like it's a kind of a summary, sort of a classic Christian thinker's summary of some of the greats. And so if you crack open your book, then maybe, like you said, it'll spur somebody on to actually open up, the classic works.
That's a great point, Lisa. I mean, I think we should think of Christianity as a knowledge tradition. We're called the people of the book. I think to give Christianity a careful evaluation, it takes time, it takes thought. Yes. Sometimes I feel like the limitations of social media get in the way of that. Mm-hmm. So largely, I try to use it to recommend good sources and invite them to give consideration. And definitely, my book is a beginner's guide. It is written for people who don't have a lot of background. And in the end, I say, don't stop here with my book. Pick up Augustine's book, pick up Pascal, read Lewis, give consideration to these kinds of things. And I want to encourage not just non-Christians to consider Christianity. I also want to encourage, as you mentioned earlier, that Christians need to grow in their critical thinking skills, and that loving God with your mind is really a critical part of loving him.
That's right.
In totality. So yeah, very good.
You know, one of the things I want to ask you, because I think that probably some people who do watch this or end up watching this are going to wonder, they're going to say, hey, you know, we can all read a lot of the Christian writers and the Christian people's views on things, but do you read, or do either of you read the views from atheists like Bart Ehrman and people like that? Do you also read the counter views and then try to reconcile that with the Christian views?
Yeah, that's it's a great question, and the answer is yes, I do. In fact, I would argue that I think the atheists in previous times are actually more formidable than the atheists today, and I'll tell you why. I think a lot of atheists today, they don't know Christianity very well, but if you go back and read Friedrich Nietzsche, if you read Jean-Paul Sartre, if you read David Hume and others, they understood Christianity because they had to study it. Today, a lot of people on the web, and even Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, kind of the four horsemen of the new atheism, they don't know Christianity very well. But somebody like a Nietzsche, whose father was a Lutheran minister, somebody like David Hume, he knew the insights of Christianity. I think the early atheism is more formidable, and I give them more attention because I think their questions need to be answered. But yeah, absolutely. I think we should always read the best argument on the other side. I also would like to encourage atheists to do that. Have they read Christian responses to their ideas? Or I like to say, are you skeptical of your skepticism?
Yeah, that's a great point. Lisa, what about you? Do you read this kind of stuff too?
Well, when I started at Biola, I really hadn't read, but they make you. So they right away, they plunge you in to the arguments against what you believe. And at first I was like, oh my gosh, you know, it was, you know, arguments that I really hadn't considered prior to that. But to know that there's a counter, I mean, it was really nice to read both of them. So for me, it was a challenge at first because it's hard to look at that stuff because you don't want to necessarily always look at that stuff. But I think that it's important to be able to understand both sides. And my brother is an evolutionary biologist. He is not a believer. And so, you know, part of what I wanted to do is to also understand his point of view. And he's very scientific minded, and he does not believe in anything beyond the material. So to talk about anything, you know, immaterial for him is like talking about, you know, fairy dust or whatever. So part of why I wanted to also read the opposite side was to be able to talk to my brother and be able to relate to him and sort of find ways of common ground. Because there are common ground, you know, there's lots of common ground, you know, I mean, like for instance, Sam Harris, even though he may not understand Christianity very well, and I've read Letter to a Christian Nation, and I completely think he does not understand Christianity very well at all, but his passion is to make the world a better place. So there's the common ground.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, and he actually, one thing about Sam Harris, I read his Moral Landscape, and I wrote a rebuttal to that, and I've actually written rebuttals to a lot of atheist stuff, but I read that, and I think that one thing that's good is he actually acknowledges objective morality, and I think that that's something that helps.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think that, you know, I think being an educated person, being a reflective, thoughtful person means that you read both sides. You know, you don't make up your mind until you've looked at various issues. And I certainly think Christians need to think through these issues. I wish every church had a class that was a class for doubters, a class where people could ask difficult questions, who struggle. I wish that our churches would be more open to intellectual people. I mean, that's a whole people group. Sometimes our churches are warm, they're fuzzy. Our churches, you know, emphasize the aesthetic side or the feeling side. I wish our churches were also places where people could come and say, look, I have a lot of doubts and I'm struggling with this. How do I work through these kinds of things? So it's unfortunate that a lot of unbelievers today think that Christians don't care about the life of the mind, don't care about learning, when of course we do. And the 9 thinkers I highlight, they're some of the brightest and the best in the entire Western civilization.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. And I agree with you with the church too, because I feel like one of the reasons why I left the Catholic Church, and I'm not trying to say anything bad about the Catholic Church, but one of the reasons I left is because, at least in the ones I went to, the sermon was never terribly deep. And it was usually, a couple of readings from the book of whatever it would be, always in the New Testament, but a couple of readings from one of the Gospels or some of the epistles, and then the priest would say a couple of words, and there was nothing really that resonated with me. And so then I went into the Baptist church. I love the contemporary music. I love the way that people seem very uplifted, and I absolutely love the way that the pastor in this church I go to spends about 40 minutes per service just speaking and tearing apart the Bible. And I love that. And he even talks about the really hard stuff like Habakkuk and why the Lord decided that he was going to basically wreak havoc on these people. So he speaks of that.
Excellent. Very, very good.
So what do you think? What do you guys think is, since both of you have read these other counter arguments, what do you think is one of the strongest arguments that they have against Christianity?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I think we have good answers to the problem of evil, pain, and suffering, and yet that's an enduring challenge. I mean, when I drive by, Children's Hospital of Orange County, I know there are young kids in there that have cancer, and I think God brings good things out of suffering. I think that we, of course, live in a fallen world. And all pain and suffering is not a bad thing. I mean, some of the hardest thing in my life have really transformed my character, that it helped me grow. But I would say that the problem of suffering remains a challenge because we care about people and we don't want to see them suffer. So I would say maybe the problem of pain and suffering is an enduring issue. But of course, I would also say that if there's no evil unless there's a standard of goodness. So if Christians are challenged by the problem of evil, I think atheists are challenged by the standard of goodness. Hitler was evil because there's a standard of goodness that he violated. So where does the goodness come from? Problem of pain and suffering is challenging, yet I think we still have good answers. Not all the answers, but good answers.
I would agree. I think the problem of suffering definitely probably tops the list. I've also heard, though, people that like my brother, who are very skeptical in anything miraculous happening. So miracles is really difficult for people to, one of the classic arguments is, why doesn't God heal an amputee? I've heard that one, and I think what happens in that attitude is there's a performance attitude that they have, like, God must perform for me. He must show me to prove his existence. And from my experience, that never works. It's like, God doesn't owe us anything, and so, I mean, the fact that my heart is beating in my chest and that I have a life is, miraculous in of itself. But I do think that the problem of miracles probably for your staunchly, materialistic thinker is challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think both of those are really good points. And I can't remember the atheist who said this, but he also highlighted what Ken said about this problem of love. So when they talk about the problem of evil, but then they realize, well, why is the world oriented towards goodness? Why is there this? In fact, studies have shown, and I always post these, but there's a study by Kinnear and colleagues from 2000, and there's one by Schwartz in 2012, and there's one in the Globe studies, and they all show that and even there's Jonathan Haidt, who's an atheist, they all show that humans have this moral ought to be benevolent. And where did that come from? It's really interesting. All over the globe, people know that they ought to be benevolent, even if they aren't benevolent. There's an is-ought distinction, kind of like what David Hume said, but they know that they ought to be benevolent. And so I think that's fascinating. But I wanted to say one thing about the miracles, because I in the chat right here, we have Susan Lambeau, and she had shared with me information on a miracle from a woman named Barbara Snyder. And so I would encourage anyone to look up Barbara Snyder's story, because apparently she had a very debilitating case of MS that had left her in her bed. She was basically in a wheelchair. She couldn't walk. Her feet were curved. Her hands were crumpled. And all of a sudden she heard the voice of Jesus that said, "My child, get up and walk." And she was able to suddenly, her atrophy, everything disappeared. Everything came back, and she jumped out of her bed. And that night she went to church. It was on a Sunday, and she went into her church, and they all knew of her. This was in 1981. She's still without, by the way. She's still free of her MS.
Wow.
But she walked down the aisle and the church just roared. And this was in Wheaton, Illinois, if anyone wants to look up this miracle that I guess Lee Strobel has written about now in his book on miracles.
Very good. Wow. Great story.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
The argument again is, then why doesn't God do that to everybody? You know, that's the argument. And Clay Jones talked about that in his Problem of Evil class. And he mentioned that if God healed every single person and answered every single prayer the way we wanted him to, would we have any room to doubt his existence anymore? And so there's always that aspect of it too, because there's always that aspect of, you know, God is allowing people to have free will. And I think the free will argument always, to me, is a really strong argument, because if every single person got healed and every single thing happened perfectly, would there be, I mean, it would be so obvious that God existed, there'd be no choice to reject him. So to me, that it weighs heavily on that. And I still think, you know, I mean, it's terrible when people don't get their prayers answered for somebody to be healed. I had a really good friend of mine, one of my best friends. She was the woman's pastor at our church. And just 2 years ago, she died of breast cancer. I mean, the whole church was praying for her. Everybody wanted her to get healed, and God didn't heal her. You know, so those things happen, you know, and how do you deal with it? You know, what do you do with all of that?
And I think if you have pain, suffering, and evil, then obviously we live in a moral universe. You can't have evil without some moral standard. We also live in a universe where we think about justice. And even though there are things that are painful and there are things we don't understand, all of those ideas of living in a moral universe, caring about justice, they fit a lot better in a Christian worldview than they do in a materialistic, naturalistic, atheistic worldview.
I agree.
Yeah, and I think C.S. Lewis even highlighted that when he was talking about the difference between Christianity and pantheism, even, because he said that they put good and evil on a same level. They equate them in their yin-yang sort of philosophy. And yet, and he talked about dualism, and he said the thing about Christianity is we make it quite clear that evil is a result of corrupt goodness. So it's you start off like that Satan fell from heaven. So, you know, it was the idea of he's created and he became evil. So evil doesn't, it's not on its own. People aren't born evil. They're born, and it's by some corruption of that body that they become evil.
Yeah. St. Augustine talked about evil as like a parasite that lives on the host of goodness, that evil is a violation. And so the great thing is some of the best Christian thinkers have been thinking about these challenging issues and writing about them for 2,000 years.
Right.
Yeah, and going back to Pascal, because you mentioned Pascal before, and I've that was definitely an interesting chapter. What do you make of, or what do you think of the arguments around Pascal's wager? Do you think that's a pretty strong argument on his part?
Well, I think sometimes it's misunderstood, but here's kind of the context for Pascal. In the 1700s, there were people, some of Pascal's friends, because he was a scientist, some of them had neither accepted Christianity or atheism. They were just kind of agnostic or skeptical, hadn't committed themselves either way. And Pascal kind of develops the wager argument as kind of a cost-benefit analysis. That is, what are the possibilities that could await us in death? And so in many respects, the wager is really to challenge people to say, should we give consideration to what our possible options are? And of course, he comes up with the conclusion that based upon probabilities, that you're going to gain by believing and you're only going to lose by disbelieving. I think Pascal didn't mean this as a standalone argument, because Pascal argued for the resurrection, he argued for prophecy, he had a whole list of apologetic arguments. But I think he intended this to kind of serve as, a shot across the bow to get people thinking so that they might open themselves to various ideas. I think the wager is a very effective apologetic tool. Again, it's not a standalone argument, but I think for some people it gets them thinking, and then they begin to look at other evidence and arguments for the faith.
Yeah. It reminds me of something. I was just thinking about it. I read Peter Hitchens' book. It's called Rage Against God. And Peter is, of course, the famous brother of the very famous one horseman named Christopher Hitchens,
Right.
who's no longer with us. But Peter said that he had also been an atheist. First, he was raised a Christian, and then he became an atheist for many years. And then he said what brought him back was he went into, I think it was, he looked at a picture of basically of hell. I can't remember exactly what the name of the picture. Yeah, he looked at that, and it frightened him so, and he realized, well, wait a second. I think it might have been almost a Pascal's wager sort of a thought. Hey, wait a second. What happens if this is actually true? And so he eventually returned to Christianity. And I think, speaking with Lisa's idea with her brother, who's the evolutionary biologist and the materialist, one thing about art and pictures and beautiful, that beautiful Notre Dame right now in France, one thing about all of this kind of stuff is that where did our apprehension of beauty and art come from? Because it's not something that the apes have. So. Yeah,
I've been to some of the, cathedrals in Europe. And I'll tell you, when I first walked in and saw the beauty, the grandeur, I wanted to worship God. And again, that idea of beauty fits well in a Christian world because you have a God who is the author of beauty. He makes us with the ability to appreciate beauty, but beauty doesn't help your survivability. So beauty seems foreign to an evolutionary worldview. I think the argument from beauty is an underutilized argument for the faith.
I love that argument, though, because there is an innate sense, I think, that people have. I mean, who does not look at a beautiful sunset and say it's ugly? I mean, most of us have a sense that, oh, that is amazing, that sunset. So that's implanted in us. There's that, that sort of a kind of goes along with the innate sense of right and wrong. There is an innate sense of beauty, And this is what I think heaven's going to be like, though. Heaven is going to be like roses without thorns.
And lots of library books.
I had a dream once that I went to heaven. This sounds kind of funny, but it was a gigantic library full of books, and I was so happy. This is the best heaven ever.
But yeah, I think that's part of, to me, the rose is a really good symbol of life on earth. Because you've got beauty, you got moments of just, you smell and but then you've got those thorns that are going to prick you and bleed. And, it's just an interesting metaphor for life on earth.
Oh, yeah.
That goes to back the phrase that the heavens declare the glory of God. And I think that one of the things that going back to Hugh Ross, one of the things that he brought my attention to is that we're in 10 habitable zones. Basically, the Earth has met the conditions for advanced life to exist, and these are 10 habitable zones that are essentially miraculous that we're here. And if you look at what the Earth looks like with beautiful mountains and rivers and seas and all this gorgeous stuff, and the sky is blue and everything's beautiful, and then you look at other planets. You look at the pictures that we see of Mars and these rocky planets that just don't look very good. It's that itself.
It's interesting that some of the Apollo astronauts said that when they went to the moon, they saw the moon, it was dark, shadowy. They looked over their shoulder and saw the Earth, just breaming with light and life. And some of these astronauts have said that I had to go to the moon to appreciate the remarkable Earth, this habitable planet, our home. And by the way, it's the visited planet. It's the planet that God took human flesh. God walked the earth according to Christianity. So the earth is a very special place. And the more we learn about extrasolar planets, the more we realize how limited they are to provide any kind of habitability for human life.
That's why it's so imperative that we take care of this one.
Yep.
That's a whole other discussion for a whole other day, but there's a lot of Christians and I've heard them say, oh, well, it's all going to burn anyways. It's, it's like that is such the wrong attitude to have. It's like, no, we are to care for this earth because of the fact that it's God's first. But, it is so special. It's so finely tuned for human life that if we trash it and we go to Mars, which they're thinking about having a colony in Mars, who would want to live there? Have you seen Mars? It's ugly.
It's cold too.
That's it.
Even and I would encourage people, besides picking up Ken's book, to also pick up Hugh Ross's books, because I think that there are just great books that people should read from Reasons to Believe. And actually, we're trying to work out some dates to talk to other people from Reasons to Believe, because I think it's just a wonderful group that you're working with, Ken.
Well, I've been here almost 22 years, and I think the organization makes a really important contribution. And I consider myself very fortunate. I hope some people listening may want to go over to reasons.org. If you have scientific challenges to faith, the kind of material we have here would be very, very helpful to you. So I hope you'll have others on. I know that they'd be happy to chat with you about various issues.
Oh, that's great. Yes, I hope so too. I wanted to ask you, we haven't talked about, and I'm looking in the inside of your book, and we haven't talked about John Calvin. And again, going back to the different types of people that you have represented here in the different sects of Christianity, he is the source of Calvinism today. And so that's a different branch. Would you like to share any information that you have about John Calvin?
Yeah, I think that probably Calvin is one of the most controversial theologians in the history of the faith, but sometimes I think he's misunderstood. Calvin is not very philosophical. He is a literary scholar. He was interested in the humanities. He is an exegete. He is a biblical scholar. And, even with his very controversial teachings about predestination, I think what people fail to appreciate is that Calvin's view of predestination was not very different than Augustine or Aquinas or even Martin Luther. And so, Calvin has a very interesting argument. He argues that all of us have what he called in Latin the sensus divinitatis. We have a sense of God's existence, and it's implanted within us. We know it intuitively, and it's enhanced when we see God's design in nature. So Calvin was not a speculative, philosophical kind of guy. He was more your biblical commentary, exegetical type of scholar. And so I try to encourage both Calvinists and Wesleyan Arminians to maybe have some respect one toward another. I think one challenge that we haven't talked about, and I've had an atheist say to me one time, he said, "Ken, why should I embrace Christianity when you Christians can't get along?" So one of the elements of my book is to try to encourage Christians to have greater respect for each other. There are times where we have to stand together. There are times we need to stand up for pro-life issues. We need to be allies together. And I don't think that Calvinists and Arminians need to be enemies. Neither do Catholics and Protestants. We can agree to disagree, but do it in a very respectful way. And so that's my appeal to, I hope, a principled ecumenism.
Yeah, and I think that highlights also what C.S. Lewis thought about many doors leading to Jesus. And so I think, because we have 2 billion Christians in the world, people have different needs and different beliefs, and I think sometimes these different forms of Christianity might be helpful to different types of people.
Yeah. That's exactly right. I think that, there clearly are times where Christians find, some Christians are deeply attracted to liturgy. Other Christians like a very different type of form of worship. And I think we need to be able to appreciate that there are going to be times where, while we have differences, there's a deep common ground. I mean, if you look at the Christian creeds, those are creeds that all of Christendom embraces. And so, again, I'm trying to encourage Christians to think critically, pursue the truth. But maybe the greatest apologetic is the apologetic of love, where we treat people fair-minded. I call it the golden rule of apologetics. Try to treat other people's beliefs in a fair-minded, careful, thoughtful way. Don't misrepresent them. Don't create straw man. And I think that puts our faith in good stead when people know that we are not going to misrepresent them, and we're going to pursue truth, and we're going to be as gracious as we can. I don't always do that. I don't always achieve that, but I'm trying.
I am too, and I just reminded me of something very funny yesterday. So I tweeted something that was controversial, because sometimes I do that and I probably shouldn't. And I had over 400 atheists responded to my tweet, and they almost all of them were trying to straw man my position. And so I found these memes with Jordan Peterson talking to Kathy Newman, and she is hilarious. If you haven't seen this interview, I strongly recommend you watch it, because he would say things like, he would talk about eating eggs and bacon for breakfast, and she said something like, you must be against vegetarians. Like, no. It was just really funny. It's the funniest interview I think I've ever seen. So I linked it. So I found memes that had some of the actual arguments, because some of the things that he was saying, and then she would come back with these hilarious straw men. So yeah, I think it's a struggle for a lot of us, because it's sometimes you don't intentionally straw man somebody. You don't want to misrepresent them, but then, and in her case, it actually looked like she did do this intentionally. But in some cases, it seems like you read something and you use your own cognitive framework to determine what exactly that means to you, and then you repeat it back to them. So I think a lot of times what I've seen is in a Sam Harris Jordan Peterson debate is where they each had to take the position, they had to steel man the other one's position. Yeah. And I think that helps in these arguments, when you have to actually try to represent the other's position so that you can actually go back and refute it.
Yeah. I always encourage my students, consider the very best argument on the other side, interpret it correctly, and then give me your response to it. And so I would say that both to the Christian and to the atheist, give consideration to the best arguments on the other side and see how you might think through those issues.
And I think it's really important to focus, like what you were all talking about regarding, sharing information, and to always do it, at 1 Peter 3:15, there's the end of says with gentleness and respect. Yeah. And I think that oftentimes we will remember the first part of 1 Peter 3:15 to always be ready to give, the hope for within you and the reasons, and, but don't just end it there. You have to always be respectful and gently share and be open and provide your ear. In other words, be a good listener, listen to the other person and hear what they have to say. Because oftentimes what I found out is that a person may have an emotional hurt behind the intellectual thing, that they're sort of coding in an intellectual reason why they don't want to believe in God. But when you get down and you really start to listen to them, there's a hurt there. They were hurt by the Catholic Church, or they were, a prayer wasn't answered, or why did God allow this, and so when we really give, a good listening ear to the other side, that really helps to promote unity, and I think that that's really important, even with different denominations. I mean, I heard somewhere that there's 33,000 different denominations. How do I know which one's right? Well, that's really that's overstating it. It's not, there's still the basic core principles of what we believe. Maybe there's variations on how you do baptisms, or there's variations on other things, but the core principles are still there. As long as you believe those core principles, I think that that's where we find the unity, and all the other stuff is not worth getting angry at or being disrespectful about. It's always really important to be a good listener.
And that's what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity, that all the branches of Christendom embrace a mere Christianity. We might differ over the secondary issues, as you mentioned, but it's important to realize that there's a lot of agreement, and sometimes that the disagreement is exaggerated. So yeah, that's a great point.
Do you think it's and one of the questions coming in from the audience is to Ken, actually, and C.S. Lewis's, and maybe Lisa, you might know on some of this too, but on C.S. Lewis's position that maybe it's not a good idea for two Christians of different sects of Christianity to get in these debates, because it could steer people away.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In the preface to Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis says that Christians should discuss their differences only when they're alone and everybody in the room is already Christian. He didn't think that, Calvinists debating Arminians, Catholics debating Protestants, he thought that would discourage non-Christians. And I think that that's correct. I think it's certainly important that Christians discuss the challenges, the difficulties that they may have, there are real differences between Catholics and Protestants. There are differences between Calvinists and Arminians, etc. But the differences there are minor compared to the differences we have with the other world's religions and among secularists. And so, there are times where you need a private meeting, not a public meeting. And I agree with C.S. Lewis. I think Christians ought to discuss their differences in a private context and try to present the best foot forward to non-Christians, because as C.S. Lewis said, even with all the differences, by God's grace, there is still a great deal of common ground.
Yeah, what do you take on? Have you read The Great Divorce? Oh, sorry, Lisa. You go ahead and first.
I think it's really challenging in our social media world. I would agree with you, Ken. I think, and C.S. Lewis. I think that it probably does not help to argue over infant baptism or whatever online. But I can't tell you how many times I've posted things, and people will of my faith will criticize me and start going off on a minor point that really doesn't make that much difference in the long run, but they go off and then it probably does look bad to a non-believer, and a non-believer is going to go, well, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to be a part of that? So I think social media, it's like a giant human experiment, I think, since Facebook's been around 2008, I think. I mean, so we haven't even been doing this for 20 years, and look how much has changed the culture. The divisiveness and the anger and these short little snippets of information that can be really hurtful, So I think that it would be really good for all of us to learn today to not do that, to take C.S. Lewis's recommendations and not do that online. If you want to go and have, coffee with a friend and hash it out, do it there. But to do it online, I think we really need to think twice about that. It's so easy. So many people get sucked into that nowadays.
Yeah,
I agree with you. I think that's it's and sadly what's happened with the advent of the social media is the younger generation has higher rates of depression. There's higher rates of suicides. There's all kinds of terrible things going on right now. But going back to C.S. Lewis, I want to say one more thing.
Sure.
Have both of you read his book, The Great Divorce?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I also read that he used to interact quite frequently with atheists, and so they say that I know we didn't have as a large a percentage of atheists back in the time that he was writing, but he did a lot of interacting with them, and I heard that he used to write letters back to them, and he was very cognizant of paying attention to them, and so I asked about The Great Divorce because I think he has a really interesting take on where atheists might be one day. What do you where some atheists might choose to be, I should say, one day.
Yeah, let me say just a couple things. Number one, C.S. Lewis wrote 10,000 letters responding to people who wrote to him. He thought if you write a book and people read it and they have questions, as an author, you have a responsibility to write back. And he wrote to many Christians, but he also had discourse with skeptics and with atheists. I mean, he was at one time an atheist himself. But I think that the Great Divorce is very powerful. One of the points he makes is maybe we should think of hell as, the gates are locked from within. That is, it's not so much that God is putting you in hell as you choose that you don't want anything to do with God. And so God says, well, your will be done, if you will. I think that that's a very powerful book. It is a literary book, so he's telling a story, and Lewis was one of the great storytellers of the 20th century. So I'd encourage people to read that book. It's very provocative.
That book really rocked my world because I really didn't think about how you go into eternity becoming either more human or less human. And that was kind of the whole, I think, the whole underlying theme of that book. It's like, okay, so if you become more human, you become more Christ-like, because Jesus didn't just come to save us, but he came to show us what it's like to be human.
Yeah.
So if you go into eternity without that, you become less human. And so the whole story was how people morphed into whatever it was that consumed them in life. So, if they were obsessively worrying, they become nothing but a worry blob or something like that. And I thought I would visualize that stuff in my mind, and it creeped me out, and it's just like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So should we wrap it up? Maybe maybe make a few final comments and let everyone know that where we are, or where they can find you, I should say.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. You can go to reasons.org. Reasons to Believe has great science faith stuff. There are a lot of my books that delve into theology, philosophy, and apologetics. And I would encourage your listeners to give consideration to reading my book. It really is a beginner's guide to 9 terrific Christian thinkers. And it then encourages you to say, hey, pick up a book by Athanasius or Irenaeus, Thomas Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Pascal. So I hope that it'll be a book that will encourage Christians and maybe challenge some of our skeptical friends.
Yeah, and before I let you off the hook, I wanted to ask you, do you have any plans for any upcoming books? Is there anything that you're working on right now?
Yes. Thank you for asking. I'm working on a book right now. It's tentatively titled Objections Overruled. I look at 20 objections that skeptical people have and provide kind of a historic Christian response to them. So this will be a book that will respond to a lot of the new atheist claims and challenges. It'll be a very much evangelistic apologetics text.
And that's very much needed. I think that sounds like something that the market needs right now. So
yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah. So Lisa, how can we find? And I know you've got a great blog.
Well, I thank you, but I want to just promote Ken. I read these 2 books. This is 7 Truths That Changed the World, and excellent book. Ken, you are a really good writer. And then this one is A World of Difference. I mean, both these books I had to read first class. But I've got so many highlights and things in here, and I just wanted, if you haven't read any of Ken's work, you really need to get some of his stuff. I mean, I haven't read your latest book. I'm gonna buy that one because I need to know more about the Christian thinkers. I think that's really important. So thank you. You're a phenomenal person and a great Christian thinker yourself.
Well, thank you, Lisa. You're very kind, and you're doing good work. Keep it up. And I like and respect both of the work that you're doing. So thank you for having me on, and thanks for participating in today's program.
Oh, well, thank you. So Lisa, I want to say, actually, let me ask both of you, how we can find you on Twitter? And Lisa, it's Think Divinely, right? ThinkDivinely.com?
ThinkDivinely.com, yeah. And then I'm at Lisa Q Thinks.
Okay.
It's hard to think.
And then Ken, how can we find you on Twitter?
Yeah, it's Kenneth Samples at Reasons, and I have a blog called Reflections that you can find on the RTB site.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to the audience for coming and participating with us today, and we hope to do this again. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop the broadcast now.
Okay.